Well, if you look at, especially within the community and mid-sized banking world, at their leadership, one of the challenges, it is typically an older white male who came up through the commercial or small business lending side of the house, right? And my wife doesn't actually find this joke funny, but bankers tend to. But I say, what do you call a chief lending officer whose loss rates of the book are, something on the order of 10%? Right. And it's like, that's a former chief lending officer. Or what do you call a head of innovation whose success rate is 90%? Well, I would say that's not a very innovative chief innovation officer because they're only doing things they already know the answer to. And innovation is about the exploration of the unknown, not just the execution and digitization of what we do know today.
So Jason, where have you seen clients embed a culture of innovation, and how have they achieved that? Has it grown organically? Has it been led from the top down? Like, what do you think are some of the factors there?
Well, it starts at the top, right? It has to with the CEO, embracing that, hey, for our core business, we are going to manage risk and, really try and minimize the amount of risk we take. But for these new things, it is about the risk return profile. So how do we actually make sure that those two things are in sync, that the risks we take are worth the potential return? And we work out a process on, how do we keep those from, bringing down the bank? Deloitte and Harvard Business Review did a study a couple of years ago about what makes the most successful CEOs, right? What are the characteristics is measured by stock performance, right? So as they went through and people ranked, the attributes, if you looked at a Steve Jobs or a Jack Welch, what are the attributes you would put, to them that made them so successful, right? And when they looked at this, it really came down to two things. One was the speed with which they were willing to make a decision, and two, their willingness to remake a decision when further data had been surfaced because they were actually out doing things. That is a very different mindset for a lot of these banks that plan. Yeah. The perpetual, we need to have a meeting to talk about the meeting, and the output of the meeting, the action item is we need to have another meeting, right? Yeah. And as Steve Blank, would say, facts lie outside the building. You are not going to think your way to greatness, within the boardroom. You actually have to get out and begin to experiment. And Jennifer, this is maybe a little bit of blasphemy since we both had a background in strategy, right, and very theoretically based. But today we talk more about you need to take an empirical approach to strategy. Empirical in the sense that you need to try something and begin to iterate on that, right? Just as you use fire to test new initiatives, you actually need to take your strategy and say, what could we do differently that would change our results? Because doing the same thing over and over again is not going to change your results.
Yeah.
I mean, if you poll, any room full of community bankers, the one topic they're all going to complain about is they don't like their core provider. Right. The second thing they'll say is their unique competitive advantage is our relationship with our customers. And
right.
This, Jennifer, is drilled into us in Monitor. It's like, if everyone's doing it, it's not unique, right?
Right.
It's called common sense. And the last piece of this around what they need to have drilled into them is they'll all say we're more of a fast follower.
Right.
And my partner JP is fond of saying, you're only half right. You're a follower, but unlikely to be very fast. Right. Why is that? Let's break it down. It takes a while for something to reach a level of ubiquity because most of these banks are following the wrong peer group, right? In terms of the investment bankers have told them, banks of about your size, that have the makeup of businesses like yours, here's your peer group. It's like, but those aren't the innovators, right? Like that's the middle of the pack. So by the time the middle of the pack has realized an innovation has occurred and they don't execute fast, right? Now we're talking your fast follower is you're 5, 7, maybe even 10 years behind,
right.
that the market. And guess what? The rest of the market is accelerating, not slowing down. COVID has created a clear breakaway of, banks that know how to innovate. And they're like, hey, we've proven that we can move fast when we want to. Let's keep moving fast.
One of the other things we wanted to ask about was around fintechs, because it feels like all banks are thinking about how to use fintechs to accelerate growth and innovation. So I guess I'm just curious, where have you seen this done well, and how do you see some of the differences play out between some of the bigger and smaller banks?
I mean, this goes back to strategy, that fintech is not a strategy.
Yeah.
Yet if I had a dollar for every time I see on a strategy or really a strategic plan, fintech is a bullet point, right? It's like, but what do you mean by fintech? And then typically bankers look at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, no, but what do you mean by that? Are you saying you want to get into banking as a service? You want to be the bank behind the fintech because strategically you want to grow a business that is not based on interest margin? Are you saying you want to adopt new technology to either run the bank more efficiently or to go do new things? I actually call those things more like bank tech than fintech, right? Like you have to know what you're trying to accomplish before you can go do that and what your unique strengths are. There's a survey done by Finastra recently that 85% of banks say they're getting into banking as a service in the next 12 months. What I don't believe the next 12 months, but given the number of banks we talk to who say, hey, we're getting into banking as a service, but they have no idea how are they going to play and differentiate to stand out, right? And they need to, this is the hard thing. Strategy is hard. You have to figure out what am I going to do and do differently. And that's based on my strengths and who my customers are. And I'd say most banks, the challenge is they think being a bank is a strategy and they think of themselves as bankers and what they deliver and are therefore totally undifferentiated.
So Jason, where do you see the opportunity now looking forward for banks, especially given we might be going into a recession?
I think banks need to rethink what their business model really is. And right now, if you look at a bank that's 2 billion, 20 billion, 200 billion, they're all pursuing the exact same business model where it's I gather deposits on one side and I make loans largely to small businesses if you're a community bank on the other side, right? Like that is my business model. And I try and stay in a risk bucket that I'm not losing on the other side. I think the big opportunity is to say, what could I do that's different than being a deposit gatherer and then a largely human-based lender on the other side? Because just digitizing this doesn't solve anything for you. I think they have great assets in that you have existing customers. And our head of product has this great quote when he thinks about it. He goes, the challenge is, can banks translate their customers who trust them into new business models faster than you can have these startups who have no customers and no trust, but they have differentiated products and business models can go the opposite direction and gather customers and gather trust.
Jason, you said something that I found pretty profound, that you don't do culture building initiatives and expect to start innovating. You innovate and that shifts your culture. But I'm just curious because I've seen a lot of our clients try things out, whether it's trips to Silicon Valley or building design thinking training. But have you seen any culture building activities focused on innovation that are effective?
Very few.
Okay.
Just to be blunt about it. So in the early days of starting out, we helped a bank set up a lab. I would say its greatest efficacy was ideas got shot down faster because the mainstream bank was not going to do anything that came out of the lab. So like anything that had the lab logo on it, you could just throw in the wastebasket and say, bullet dodged, right? We're not doing that. That's crazy. Okay. The innovation tourism, I find in the companies that exist that make money doing it, I look at and I'm like, I will sometimes refer to it as the fintech petting zoo. It doesn't make you a farmer. Go to the zoo, pat the little animals on the head, come back and say, but we could never do that, right? The only thing that is going to change it might be good inspiration, right? So like Finovate's coming up. You should absolutely go to Finovate, but you should know why you're going. What are we looking to accomplish strategically? Get some ideas around it. Should we be partnering with one of those companies? Should we be doing it ourselves? Where is it going to fit? But you better have an objective on what we're trying to accomplish before you go. Because otherwise you come back and you're like, met a lot of interesting companies, but so what? Corey LeBlanc, who's the CTO of Locality Bank down in Florida, at his previous bank, he'd made the comment to me, he's like, the worst thing that ever happens to me is when our CEO would go to one of these conferences that had like an innovation exhibit hall or something like that. And he'd come back with like a fistful of cards and would hand them to me all excited. Right. And he's like, and I go through and I figure out, which ones are real, which ones, are smoke and mirrors, which ones can work with our systems, and then I'd get back and present to the CEO, and it's like, okay, so of the dozen cards, I think these are 3 things worth pursuing. And the CEO would meet me with a blank stare. It's like, what are you talking about? It's like, but why did you give me? I was like, because, it's innovation, because innovation, because fintech are not good answers to things.
Right.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious, like in that example you gave where anything that came out of the lab would sort of end up in the bin, what was the point behind it? Why did they invest in it?
Got a lot of press.
Okay.
And, they felt innovative, I call that the innovation theater side of the house, where let's do some things. We've got a room with some inspirational quotes, and you sit on bean bags, and it's got Legos and fidget spinners, on it. The walls are whiteboards. But if you're not actually fundamentally changing what you're trying to do and how you're trying to accomplish it, it hasn't changed your culture.
So if you're someone that's in that position now, someone that's leading a lab that isn't getting traction in the business, what would you say they should be doing differently?
I mean, I think the first is they need to get serious. Like if they're going to do something to change their culture, I would say go read up on strategy, like figure out what real strategy is and have a discussion around that. I was with a consultant from Crow yesterday, Madeline Frieden, who works on the strategy side. She said something that was absolutely brilliant that I hadn't thought about before, that for a lot of these organizations, whatever their strategy doc is, also serves this purpose of it's how we connect people to the organization. And what's interesting about that insight is if you say, hey, we're going to go focus not just on small business, but small business that does multi-tenant family, type properties, for commercial real estate. And then you end up with the mortgage group going, what about us? We're not in the strategy. We're not important. And you're like, oh yeah, so we need to throw in something about mortgage. And then you end up with your retail going, what about us? And we're like, okay, so let's pack something into this. And so suddenly your strategy is, this Frankenstein of making people feel like what they're doing is important. And her insight that I thought was super impactful is you need to separate those two things. You need a strategy that you're leading into that not everyone's going to participate in the same way.
Yeah.
But you need to then also go solve for the mechanism. How do I let them know what they're doing is important? Otherwise, we should quit doing it.
So is there anything else that someone sitting in that sort of role that's trying to innovate in a corporate environment, is there anything else that you think that they should take away or think about?
Well, that customer centricity, and I do think actually getting out and thinking through what are we going to do differently, and figuring out that core competency. One of the exercises we like to do with banks is say, you have to fire half your customers tomorrow. Which half do you keep and why? Right. And what are you going to do for them? And go spend time with customers, not, bringing them cookies and shaking, hey, is there anything we can do for you? The customer doesn't know. What you need to do is go observe the customer, much more like an anthropologist, and observe their pain points. Banks have a ton of data too that we just don't utilize. We should be able to understand our customers' pains from a financial perspective better than they do, right? So spend time with data, whether that is, from the transactional data or by observing them to see where the pain points are and work backwards. That's what needs to drive your fintech partnering strategy and your innovation strategy.